Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, everybody. That was a fascinating Q&A, and I can assure you that if, in fact, I do develop a menstrual cycle, that global warming will have caused it, because one thing we know, right? It's the Twinkie defense of the 2000s. It caused everything. Everything. Cooling, warming, wet, dry, ice, no ice, drought, no drought, you name it. And I documented this. Whatever happens, it's a wonderful theory. It's a religion. Whatever happens is proof of what you posited. You have a rare treat or misfortune of getting me moments after I've just left a presentation in the Senate by one of the leading alarmists, Al Gore's consultant, Naomi Oreskes from the University of California, San Diego. And she actually said, we should be very worried because predictions were made by some people of some things that have come true. This is very anti-scientific. She said people did predict, as did some climate models, that there would be increased rainfall in some areas. Well, grab the women and children. Look, these are now called predictions when they do come true, and if you throw enough balls in the air, of course, some are going to land, but they're called projections whenever they're pressure tested. These are computer models which provide us these lurid scenarios that are like Al Gore's movie, like The Day After Tomorrow, but quite obviously not like reality. You say, well, what about 2005, Hurricane Katrina? Well, okay, it was a Category 3 hurricane when it hit New Orleans, which was a population, many of which were conditioned to state support for most needs in life, lying below sea level in Hurricane Alley. And after Hurricane Katrina struck the United States, the European Parliament actually drafted a resolution. I quote it in the book. They didn't pass it in this form, but their legislator of the year, a Swede, of course, drafted this resolution claiming that whereas the long-predicted consequences of global warming have occurred, in that poor populations living in low-lying coastal areas have borne the brunt of severe weather. Now, so before global warming, just to get this right, poor populations living in low-lying coastal areas used to stare happily overhead as the storms proceeded inland to hit the rich areas. That's the premise, because we know none of this ever occurred. The climate was stable before man came along, the scourge of man. Climate was stable. That's one premise. It's been debunked by the National Academies of Sciences. It's called a hockey stick. It's a chart that purports to show stable, what we'll call climate, but in this case temperature, 4,000 years. And then it spiked when man began procreating in significant numbers and actually unleashed the horrors of affordable energy is when they claim the spike began. Now, this actually was in the most recent, before this one you heard about a few months ago, IPCC, this is the UN body, chartered expressly to support a future global warming treaty. Okay, so that's the mandate. You have been chartered to support a future global warming treaty, which we did get. And they had this chart, and it was called the smoking gun. And the author of the chapter that included it happened to be the guy whose research produced this chart. Nobody checked it. Subsequently, somebody did, some Canadians, and they said, you know what, the previous UN report showed what we all remember to be history. The medieval warming period. 1,000 years ago, Vikings were farming Greenland. It was called Greenland for a reason. Not as a joke to draw people because they couldn't populate it, but because, which is a myth, it was green. They were actually farming livestock, and they were feeding them, growing forbs to feed these animals. I'm sorry if Tom Bethel covered some of this, and I haven't, and I missed Tom's presentation, but we were rewriting history and airbrushing it in true Orwellian fashion. There was something called the Little Ice Age afterward, and I'm sorry, I have a wonderful slideshow that I can email any of you who are interested, but we know from cultural icons, we see the Bruegel prints, all of the etchings, we know that Europe was very, very cold, and the settlers in America found very, very cold times when the Hudson would ice over, and the Thames used to ice over, and they had a frost fair every year in London, and it doesn't happen anymore, and it must be our fault because it just makes sense. But in the 70s, it was cooling for 30 years, from the 40s to the late 70s. And people panicked and said, CO2 emissions are going up, the temperature's going down, it just makes sense. The same people who are now residing comfortably at Stanford University, Stephen Schneider, Paul Ehrlich, the general doomsayers, the Malthusians, who believe that people are pollution, just enough of them, way too many of you and me, and we need to drastically reduce Gaia, the goddess Mother Earth, by 2/3. That's the only area where they disagree. How low the population, the body count, how high the body count has to go. You know, in law school, Phyllis, they used to say, look to your left, look to your right. One of them had to go. They didn't everybody was graduated by the time I got to WashU, but now it used to be look to your left, look to your right. One of them has to go. The environmentalist mantra is look to your left, look to your right. They both got to go. Because we are over 6 billion now. They say Gaia, the goddess Mother Earth, cannot sustain more than 2 billion, so guess who's got to go? And yet they do not depopulate their own numbers in any statistically significant fashion other than chain smoking and living in Seattle. Now, I'm going to just go through the global warming myths here briefly. Climate was stable till man came along. That's nonsense. This hockey stick was debunked by the National Academies of Sciences, as I mentioned, not because they were sicked on this, because it was proven it was using taxpayer money and it was a fraud, and it belied the previous UN chart, which again showed history as we knew it. It was warm, then it was cold, then it was warm, and that climate changes, always has, always will. That makes me a climate change denier. Weather happens, always has, always will. Weather's always unpredictable. Weather's often severe. That's going to happen. But we're pretending it never did happen. And so the National Academies were trotted out to assess the attacks on the hockey stick. This was by a congressman from the Sierra Club named Sherry Bowler, who's now retired, fortunately. And he got the wrong answer. It wasn't the answer he was expecting. So now it disappeared. It was the smoking gun in the prior UN report. It's what everybody on the news saw and showed. And it didn't appear in the next one. It was like one of the old Soviet Politburo gentlemen waving who was now a non-person and airbrushed out. It never existed. No explanation as to why the smoking gun wasn't in this report. But what did the report say about sea level rise? Well, we know 20 feet, right, Al Gore? Well, and I'm not a scientist, so I can't challenge Al Gore. People have said this to me. Well, you're not a climate scientist. You can't challenge Al Gore's claims. And I'm thinking, okay, well, we've established I did complete my graduate education, if not in climate science. We know he didn't. He tried twice, was invited not to return both times. Never in climate science. But Gore says 20 feet of sea level rise. Where does he find that in the scientific literature? Answer, nowhere. Nobody says this. One guy, James Hansen, who started this in a hearing chaired by Al Gore on June, I think, 21st, 1988, hottest day of the year in Washington. Some senators involved, like Tim Wirth, have now admitted on TV they chose that date, turned off the air conditioning because they wanted Hansen to be mopping his brow. Okay, that is the alarmist argument in a nutshell. He was saying this to PBS Frontline, so he figured, you know, nobody watches anyway, nobody's going to find out. But he did admit it's on tape, and I TiVoed it. So we know that's what they do. But Hansen and Gore, Hansen says 80 feet sea level rise. Hollywood says whatever that day after tomorrow says. Gore says 20 feet. The UN, which is fairly alarmist because, again, they were chartered to support a future global warming treaty, says anywhere between 17 and 27 and 23 inches. Now, sea levels rise. And if you live in New Orleans and you're used to people airlifting you out, you're going to think, well, that's horrible, I'm in danger. No, you're not. Sea levels rise. Between ice ages, that's what they do. And they recede during glaciations. We are, fortunately, in an interglacial period now. We know this because ice used to cover an awful lot of the planet, and we can see it, and it doesn't anymore. Well, they rise 8 inches per century on average. It's a fairly steady rate. It deviates very little. 8 inches per century. It's undetectable. The beaches are exactly where you left them as a child or where I left them as a child. You can't see it. You can't notice it. All of the people in Martha's Vineyard worrying about this can look out their back deck and see the beaches are just where they left them when they moved in the 60s. Now, sea levels are not a threat. We continue to subsidize construction in storm pathways, okay? Say lawyers and lobbyists and lawmakers' homes in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. You can't insure a house if you build it there because with about the same probability as a train coming down the tracks, if I should choose to build a house on the train tracks, your house will suffer severe damage and maybe get wiped out. We know this.